Hello and welcome back. My name is Eddie Jennings from the website ejsllc.com, and this is the second video in a two-part series about the basics of music intervals. In this video, we're going to expand and build on the idea of the whole step and the half step to build major scales, which is a very common scale that you hear in music. We're also going to talk about diatonic intervals. The goal of this video is to complete the foundation for some future videos that I'm going to do about chromatic intervals and some more advanced concepts. But for the basic study of intervals, the previous video and this one will give you a good foundation. So without further ado, let's jump right in. We have our note ruler here from the last video where we talked about whole steps and half steps. We're going to take this concept now and start building major scales. Major scales, you hear that in music just everywhere. I mean, it is, I'm not sure if it's possible to go through life and have not experienced a major scale. So we're going to learn how to construct them using the knowledge that you're learning about whole steps and half steps. So for a major scale or any scale, minor scales, there's three forms of minor scales, pentatonic scales, on and on and on. All scales are simply a collection of an interval pattern. And so for the major scale, that interval pattern is whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step. So 2 whole steps and a half step and 3 whole steps and a half step. And to be able to construct major scales, we just need to follow a couple of rules. The first rule is the interval pattern. And the second rule is stay in alphabetical order. The musical alphabet is from A to G, and then once you get to G, if you continue ascending or raising in pitch, you will start back over at A, and then if you were to descend G down to A, if you were to continue going lower or descending in pitch, you will start back over at G and go backwards. So we're going to start with a C. And here we are on the note ruler here at a C. And if we were to spell a major scale, I'm going to do this, actually I'll do it in red. Let me erase this here. We'll do it in red. So our starting point, that's the C. And we have C right here. This will be our first note of the scale. All scales have to have a starting point, so we're going to start at C. Now, to build this major scale, we have to follow the interval pattern. So whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. And then, depending on where we land on the note ruler, we need to make some decisions about what to pick, because from the last video, if you remember, we talked about enharmonic notes that are spelled the same, spelled differently but sound the same. So we have to make some choices here. And again, the example is cat. You can make the sound of cat using K-A-T, but K-A-T is not the proper spelling. So, unless you like Kit Kat bars. Anyway, so we have the whole step. So C, a whole step above C would bring us to D. Remember, each tick is a half step, so we would skip one to get to the whole step. We don't have any enharmonic equivalent for D, so there's no choice. D would be the second note of the scale. Now, the next interval is also a whole step. So we'll skip the tick in the middle because that's our half step, and so we end up here. So we have to make a choice between E and F flat. What would be the appropriate note to choose? Now, sounding wise, they're going to sound the same. You would press the same key on the keyboard as E and F flat, but we have to make a choice as far as spelling. And so when you're faced with a choice, you want to choose whatever is in alphabetical order. So if we were spelling our alphabet A, B, C, D, E, F, G, we would move from A, B, C, D, E, we would move from D to E. We would not spell the alphabet A, B, C, D, F. So when choosing between E and F flat, we're going to choose E because that stays within alphabetical order. Now, so the next interval is the half step. Well, now we're only going to move over 1 on the note ruler, and we're faced with another choice, F or E sharp. Well, if we stay with alphabetical order, we typically don't repeat letters. We wouldn't spell the alphabet A, B, C, D, E, E, G. We would move to the next letter. So when you're having to make your choice here between F and E sharp, we're going to choose F for the half step. All right, the next interval is a whole step, so we're going to skip the tick in the middle, and that's going to land us at G. We don't have an enharmonic equivalent there, so that's our whole step, G. The next interval is a whole step, so again, we skip the tick in the middle. That lands us on A. No enharmonic equivalent, so we have A. Let me catch up down here. A is our whole step. So the next whole step, if you remember from the first video, we talked about how this line could extend. If I were to draw the next tick, that would be A sharp, and then on and on and on. So we're going to start back over, go all the way around here, back over. So the half step would be A sharp. The whole step would be B. Now we have to make a choice. Do we do B or C? Well, if we follow the alphabetical order, B comes after A. So that whole step would be a B. And then we have to have a half step. So if we're at B, we move one tick over, and we're back to where we started. We have C. Thus, a major scale built off of C is going to be C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. So with this knowledge, the interval pattern, and understanding that you have to go in alphabetical order, you know enough to be able to build any major scale. And you also know enough to figure out what notes, albeit you could probably figure out pitches that would sound like a major scale, you would not be able to properly spell a major scale starting on them. So let me show you an example of that. I'm going to erase our red marking here. I'll give you an example of a starting note that would not produce a correctly spelled major scale. We use orange as our color for this. So let's say that we started on, actually we'll start on A sharp. So we have our first note of the scale, A sharp. So the interval pattern, whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half, right? So the first interval is going to be a whole step. So if our starting pitch, let me get rid of this one little red spot there. If our starting pitch is A sharp and we move a whole step, that would land us at C or B sharp. So we have to make a choice since we have two options here. They're enharmonic notes. And our rule is we go in alphabetical order. So the next note that we would pick is B sharp, because C would break alphabetical order, would be skipping the letter B. So next we have an interval of a whole step. Well, if we follow our note ruler here, we would skip over the C sharp D flat, because that's just a half step. We have to leap all the way to D. Well, there's no enharmonic equivalent for D, and so therefore that would be our only choice for the whole step. And as far as the proper spelling of major scales, that breaks the rule of alphabetical order. So right there, we really can't continue. Now, it's possible that we could keep going and we'd have a half step above D, and we would probably use E flat because that would be the next note in the alphabetical order. Then the whole step above E flat, that would bring us to F, staying in alphabetical order. And then if we were to do another whole step, that would be F to G. Do another whole step, G to A. And then half step, well, if we stay in alphabetical order, we'd go to B flat, but that looks kind of odd because we didn't have, in our C major example, that the first and last note ended up being the same letter. And also, if you look at this, we have B to D, like I mentioned before. That's not an alphabetical order. And another strange thing, you typically aren't going to see sharps and flats put together in a major scale. If you're going to have sharps in a major scale, any notes that are altered like that are going to be sharp, or if you have flats, you're not going to see a mixture of it. So although if you were to play these letters on a keyboard or any other instrument, it's going to sound like a major scale, but spelling wise It is not. And so we wouldn't consider A sharp a valid starting point for major scales. Now, from here, we're going to move to the keyboard, and I'm going to show this to you in action and also start talking about something called diatonic intervals. If you remember, so far our basic building blocks are just whole steps and half steps. I'm going to give you a couple of different names for some intervals as they apply to the major scale, and hopefully it won't be too confusing for you, but I think if you think it through for a bit, it'll make sense to you. So let's head over to the keyboard. So let's take our C major scale and have it in action here. So if we take our C, this is middle C on my electronic keyboard here. And if we were to follow the interval pattern, we have whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. So C to D is our whole step. Remember, we skipped the C sharp, D flat in the middle because on the note ruler that was only one tick. So C to D is our whole step. Then we have another whole step, D to E. Remember, this is the note directly adjacent, so the distance from D to E is going to be the whole step. Then E to F. And if you recall from the first video, we talked about the natural half steps. E to F is a natural half step. There's no key in between. F to G would be the whole step. G to A would be another whole step. A to B would be yet another whole step. That's that set of three. And then B to C would be the last half step. And in this case, it ends up being a natural half step. So I could take really any pitch and play a major scale, but we learned that some starting notes aren't valid for spelling a major scale. And I'll give you that example, that A sharp example. If I were to play the notes that we spelled out, the A sharp, B sharp, D, which broke the rule, E flat, F, G, A, and then have to pick A sharp or B flat, that's still a major scale. Just spelled terribly. If we were to choose B flat as that starting note instead of A sharp, and if you go through the interval pattern and use the note ruler, you'd find that spelling starting on B flat would produce you a correctly spelled major scale. So the other thing I wanted to talk about were diatonic intervals. So far, your knowledge of intervals, if my video series has been your first exposure to it, you know about whole steps and half steps. So we can also name intervals using the ordinal numbers, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, and so forth. So in a major scale, if I were to just start on C, so the first note of the C major scale, there are several diatonic intervals within a major scale, and the word diatonic means within the scale. So I'm not considering, even though between C and C here, there are far more than 8 notes, which if you noticed when we were spelling our major scale, we had 7 letters, one of which repeated. There are many notes in between. Diatonic refers to just the notes in that major scale. So C to D, we are changing the letter by 1, therefore this is the interval of a second. Now something that would confuse some students of mine is like, we moved 1 note but we're calling it a second. When you are counting intervals that are using the ordinal numbers, we count the first note as 1. So 1, 2, that's an interval of a second. Now, in a major scale, we call this a major second. Now, I'm not going to go into the difference between major and minor intervals. That's a little bit beyond the scope of the basics. When I do my advanced series on intervals, we'll really dig into the different types of seconds. But just know that in a major scale, the second is called a major second. So if I were to start at C and move up to the 3rd note, C to E, we call that's a third. C is 1, D is 2, E is 3. That's a third. In a major scale, we're going to call that a major third. C to E. If I were to move to the 4th note, this is a little bit special. We call this a perfect fourth. Now, the reason for that is beyond the scope of our basic interval study, but understand in a major scale, the diatonic interval of the first note to the fourth note is called a perfect fourth. Now, if I were to go to the fifth note, we call that a perfect fifth. If I move to the sixth note, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, C to A is a major sixth. The sixth is not considered a perfect interval. Again, that is outside the scope of what we're doing, just accept that the sixth in a major scale is going to be a major sixth. If we were to move to the seventh note, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, that is a major seventh. And then if we were to move to the eighth note, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And if you're a piano player, I know you just cringed. I did not finger that scale properly. We don't call this an eighth. We call this an octave. And we also call it a perfect octave. So we have major second, major third, perfect fourth, perfect fifth, major sixth, major seventh, and perfect octave as the diatonic intervals in a major scale. Now you might be asking, what if you were to do this? And we play just the same note twice. Well, we call that a unison. And given with the fourth, the fifth, and the octave, we call it a perfect unison. So perfect unison all the way through perfect octave. Those are the diatonic intervals in a major scale. Now notice I have only went up in pitch. I'm not going down in pitch. I'll save that for my advanced series on intervals, because that gets into what's called interval inversions, which is a little beyond the scope of just giving you the basics. But this is how you can expand from just the whole steps and half steps to building a scale, and then expanding your vocabulary of intervals by being able to name the diatonic intervals in a major scale. So we covered a lot of material in this video about major scales and diatonic intervals and how we take our whole steps and half steps and arrange them into a pattern. Don't worry if you feel a little overwhelmed at this point. It's a lot to take in at once, but I am confident if you take the time to kind of sit down and think it through and use that note ruler to map out the spelling of your major scales and think about the concept of ordinal counting, the second, third, fourth, fifth, and just accepting that some intervals are called major, some are called perfect, you'll find that it's really not that confusing. So thank you for taking the time to watch. I hope that you found it useful for you. Make sure that you click the little thumbs up like button on the video if you enjoyed the content. Also make sure that you subscribe to the channel so that way you can be aware of when I release the series on advanced interval study where I go into chromatic intervals. You'll know when that's happening. And also you can click the little I icon, which I believe is going to be in the upper right of your corner. I'll have a link to my series on the basics of notation, so you can kind of take some of this knowledge about intervals and apply it to how you would actually write the music itself on the staff. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you the next time.